Folks, TMBS 160, Fear is Voter Suppression and Why Women Have Better Sex Under Socialism. I'm Matt Leck. Joining me, it's Alicia Brooks.
I'll join you.
And David Grisco.
How's it going, Matt?
It's going well. We are about 20 days, I haven't counted, but about 20 days from the election. About a few decades away from climate catastrophe.
20 days away from climate catastrophe.
Yeah, and a few months from Christmas. So that's where we're at. I think that's roughly how I feel. How are you guys doing?
My tea bag says the creation of 1,000 forests is in one acorn.
The creation of what? 1,000
forests is in one acorn. So that's the optimism for today, and that is
I like that.
Ralph Waldo Emerson quote.
Of course. Okay, there you go. Emerson coming in hot. The Transcendentalists start off episode 160.
I'm good, man. I just got to spend some time this weekend walking through the woods, keeping on theme, so I'm feeling pretty fresh and ready to go.
Yeah, I got into nature. Speaking of the Transcendentalists.
I got into nature. I spent some time in Trump country, which is always a fun experience.
Yeah, did they live deliberately up there?
What? Yeah, definitely did.
Let's talk about voter suppression, David. And it's I think a pretty pertinent topic to our current moment.
Yeah, and if you have the first tweet ready,
yes.
Some states have had early voting going on for the past couple of weeks, but we're really starting to hit this moment of the election. On Monday, Georgia opened up for early voting, and today Texas did as well. And if we have this first tweet ready to go, Matt, or do you need a second?
Here it is.
Yeah. What we were seeing were significant ways for people to be able to vote in the first couple of days. I mean, this one goes all the way around. I've seen longer lines. I've seen folks who, in Georgia specifically, who are waiting in line around, 10 to 11 hours. Now, this has been met with a kind of mixture of reactions, primarily from a lot of liberals, praising all these people. And absolutely, folks standing up and dealing with this kind of nonsense is something to be happy about. The fact that so many people are getting ready to vote and voting early is definitely a good sign. But that being said, people should not have to put themselves through this kind of struggle to be able to exercise their basic democratic rights. In Texas today, there were significant kind of long lines in cities like Austin and Houston, and similar reactions, right? It's definitely exciting that so many people are showing up, much more than in previous years. But let's not forget that a lot of people are doing this because they are so afraid of, for example, mail-in voting not counting. And they're definitely afraid of massive lines and technical failures on election day. But even more specific and more dangerous is what's going on in Texas right now, where the U.S. the Fifth Circuit Court of Appeals decided late Monday that Texas counties, they basically ruled in favor of Governor Greg Abbott's directive that each county in Texas will only have one place to drop off their mail-in ballots, which is an absolutely ridiculous situation when you're thinking about a state that has some of the largest cities in the country, along with counties that are massive just geographically. There's no doubt about it that the right wing in this country has fully committed to making voting as difficult as possible. And there's a lot of different tactics that they've used to pursue this: lack of funding, ID laws. The GOP is leaning on the most anti-democratic aspects of our system. That's why in my lifetime, both of the Republican presidents that have come to power through the Electoral College, not through winning the popular vote. And obviously the fact that during COVID, we should be making it easier to vote than not is another great example of how much this system is failing. But we're seeing also this lack of trust in electric voting and even in mail-in voting, which is going to mean that the systems that we have in place, which are not up to the task in a normal election year, are really going to be stressed. It's incredible that it's already taken this long for all these blue states to allow vote by mail. But what we're also seeing is one of the most ridiculous aspects of the American system, and something that is always interesting when you talk to somebody who's not from the United States about, for example, presidential politics, the enthusiasm gap, right? Where we don't necessarily measure or think about how many people in the country want this kind of person to be president, how many people actually want Biden to be president. We say, how enthusiastic are people to go through the ridiculous task of taking a day off of work, waiting in line all day long, right? That's an amazing indictment of the American system, that we're not even talking about how many people support a candidate, how many people are willing to basically put themselves through a very difficult process to be able to cast their, to participate in democracy in the most basic level. But it's not that surprising when you remember that the history of the United States has basically been a long fight over the ideals that were put forward at the founding and their lack of realization for everyday people. There's two different views of voting in the United States. One that is highly reactionary, but it's quite prevalent, that voting is a privilege. And then there's another view that voting is a right. Now, the left, especially socialists, I feel like fall much more on the right side of that dynamic. But you got to understand that all of these institutions in the American system don't necessarily treat voting as a right. Many places they treat it as privilege. The founders were incredibly suspicious of democracy. Go back to reading Federalist 10, where James Madison rightfully pointed this out, but you have to remember what they try to do with it. When James Madison wrote, "The most common and durable source of factions has been the various and unequal distribution of property. Those who hold and those who are without property have ever formed distinct interests in society." I bring this up to remind people that the American founders were very, very aware of class struggle, and they were very worried about the majority of people in this country, that being people who don't have property, who don't have money, who are working people, and not to mention obviously the fact that this was a system that was created while slavery was a primary mode of production in the country. That the founders were very aware that if the majority of the people who don't have property, the people who aren't rich, were ever able to get a majority, by nature of their voting, then the kind of aristocracy that the founders were trying to create and protect would be at threat. I also would just like to add, because it's just hilarious what, the kind of things that they were worried about, for example. So this is Madison also saying is what would happen if you allowed a pure democracy in the United States. A rage for paper money, for an abolition of debts, for an equal division of property, or for any other improper or wicked project. So they basically, their idea was by trying to deny a pure democracy at that period of time was to try to prevent that kind of politics from coming into power, a politics that was going to empower the vast majority of people, that was not going to allow for the unequal distribution of the resources of society. That's what they were worried about, and you have to remember that was the starting point of this system. It's always been a fight for us to get the vote for normal people. It really wasn't until the early 19th century that we started to see an expansion for working people. And it's an interesting, historical fact that primarily came out of the War of 1812, where you had all of these people having to put their bodies and lives on the line for the United States, wondering, wait, why am I forced to fight for this country if I'm not able to vote? It was something that was demanded and won by organizing and challenging the system, not by playing to establish norms. There's a really great interview in Jacobin that I suggest people check out called "Why Voter Turnout is So Low in the United States" with Alexander Kaiser, whose name I might be mispronouncing. But it really goes through this history and how much of a fight it always was to be able to realize this basic right of voting in a democracy. That's a little bit, anyways, that interview gets a little bit into the history, but it was this radical period that we saw in the late 19th century where you had the Knights of Labor, these big northern industrial cities, the populists and Black and poor whites joining together in the South that were challenging the system of capitalism. That's when you started to see this more technical and developed version of voter suppression. And why? Because people were challenging the rich. People were challenging capitalism. The founders were right to be afraid of what would happen to their rights and privileges if working people were able to express their rights to vote. How did they do it? They used poll tax, taxes, literacy tests, anti-immigrant movements, would do things like you had to prove that you had a grandfather who was born in the United States. In New York City, for example, they would hold elections on the Sabbath so that the growing Jewish population, which had a high concentration of socialists, weren't able to vote, right? So this is an old story in the United States, voter suppression. And in the past few decades, we have seen a GOP that is committed to their very core to limiting the right to vote through full-on voter suppression, using things like ID laws, and for making it as difficult to vote as possible. But you also have to understand that while the GOP are the people who are relying on this overtly, right, and that's their only way to win elections, the political bosses of the Democratic Party don't care about changing the dynamic into higher turnout, right? That's why you don't see a Democratic Party that's fully committed to policies that will expand the vote. And Jesus Christ, this is 2020. The fact that the Democratic Party is now starting to make a bigger stink about, voter suppression by the GOP is ridiculous. We should have been having this fight starting in 1990, 1980, hell, the beginning of this country. What is the fixation of the Democratic Party? To turn towards the suburbs, right? A part of this country that has not had the kind of barriers to voting that more urban and rural parts of the country have as well. Look, it's going to take a fight to make sure that we have this basic right in democracy. The working class in this country has the lowest turnout, and that's a big part of, that's mainly caused by voter suppression, but it's also what I'd call voter depression, the realization that your life is not going to change that much by voting for a party that does not have your interests at heart. We've got a long fight ahead of us, and that means challenging the overt suppression of the GOP, but also challenging a Democratic Party that is uninterested in expanding the electorate. Bernie Sanders was an incredible example of this. His strategy was fundamentally that we're going to bring in a pool of new voters into the democratic process. And we saw glimpses of where that was possible, most notably in Nevada, right? But as we were talking with Matt Karp last week, the way that the primary system works in this country, it skews to the elites. It skews to those who are already wealthy. And the Democratic Party also has a system of suppression to try to keep everyday people out from voting in their primaries. It's an interesting fact, by the way, that, in 2016 and 2020, when we were complaining about the way that the Democratic Party was rigging the election against Bernie Sanders, people would say that the Democratic Party is a private organization. So it doesn't have any responsibility to, provide a fair election. That's the same argument that the Democratic Party made at the beginning of the beginning of the 20th century, when they had what were called white primaries, and they only allowed white people to vote in their primary. So even though that was illegal federally, right, and illegal by law, because it was a private institution, they argued that they were allowed to discriminate. And it took the Supreme Court, decades and decades to strike that down finally. Fearing that you're going to be unable to vote, the fact that people are now having to line up for hours and hours and hours to vote early because they're afraid that if they try to show up on election day, they won't have the right to vote, that fear is suppression. Defunding of the basic apparatus of voting, that's suppression. Hurdles to voting are suppression. We've got to fight back with the knowledge that the only times that we have radically expanded the electorate have not come because party bosses have now decided that they want to hear from everyday people. They've come because working class people have united together and demanded what seemed radical, demanded what seemed impossible. And that's exactly what we're going to have to do with voting in this country, because we're just not going to be delivered the solutions to this massive problem of voter suppression from up high.
Yeah, with regard to this points about Democrats, I think one of the reasons to the extent we're doomed right now is because we have two parties in this country, one of whom sees their job is to nakedly suppress democracy, and the other party sees itself as its job to manage it and not to cultivate it. And right, like that's why none of this stuff has been done before, is because they don't really like. I don't want to be too conspiratorial, but when I moved here, like North Dakota, we didn't have to register to vote, right? When I moved here, I first tried to register in the 2016 election to vote for Bernie in the primary, and I got my registration sent back to me unopened a few days before the primary happened. I don't know exactly what happened. Maybe it was my fault somehow, but something seems weird there, and I wasn't able to cast my vote for Bernie in the primary. Like I 100% do not trust We had somebody call in today that said they became like a poll watcher or a judge, or election judge, like these sorts of official election watching positions. I think if you have the ability to get in those positions, do it, honestly, because I think it might be really important. And then I also wanted to bring up a couple tweets. One is from a Mike Duncan, who put this really as succinctly as I've ever seen it put. So do you know who this Chad Hasty is, David?
Okay, so this guy's he's just an idiot. But he's like a local talk radio host, right-wing guy in Lubbock.
Okay, right. So Texas Tech, is that it?
Yeah.
Chad Hasty says, it's not hard to vote in Texas. Honestly, it should be harder. You should at least have to pass a basic civics test before voting. And then Mike Duncan says, a good question for a basic civics test might be, explain in your own words the nefarious and racist history of literacy tests in voting, which is, perfect. And then we also have, speaking of the party that sees its job is to suppress democracy, PragerU's Will Witt, who hasn't really been catching fire, I feel like, the way the donors might want him to, but he's kind of dumb. But here he is talking about how the Electoral College is critical for our republic. And here he goes.
What's up, guys? This is Will Witt with PragerU. Today we are in rural Colorado. It's extremely cold, but we're here today.
Why don't you stay in L.A., Will? Anyway.
Talking about the Electoral College. In Colorado, they want to get rid of the Electoral College. They want all of this state's electoral votes to go towards whoever wins the national popular vote in America. This is unconstitutional. The Founding Fathers made the Electoral College to prevent the tyrannical majority from controlling the minority. Imagine if you have $1 and me and my cameraman both vote to take your dollar. That's democratic, that's the majority, but that's not fair. And the Founding Fathers knew this. Imagine states
Talk
like
about that example later.
Wyoming, New Mexico, states with low populations. If there is no electoral college, that means states like California, New York, and Texas would dominate these states. These smaller states with smaller populations wouldn't have a voice without the Electoral College. The Founding Fathers made the Electoral College so that even the smallest minority would have a voice in all elections.
Whenever the Democratic Party comes up now, I'll forever have David Feldman in my head saying that the difference in the two parts of the Democratic Party is Amy Klobuchar, just don't let your dreams get too big, and Elizabeth Warren saying it's okay to dream big as long as those big, big dreams never come into fruition. That's forever going to make me laugh. Pray for you.
I mean, but... Yeah, the Electoral College is so ridiculous, especially if you're talking about a situation where we're still maintaining a system like the Senate, which is also very undemocratic. It's just amazing to me that people think that like land in and of itself should be given rights.
That's what's so funny is like, my favorite category slippage here or swap they do, which goes back to Nancy McLean's Democracy in Chains and the Koch brothers Buchanan project, is conflating billionaires as an oppressed minority group alongside like gay people and black people and whoever, right? Like you got to protect the minorities. And I fundamentally, it's like we're going to attack like trans people, for instance, and then say, well, you guys like democracy. If it wasn't for this democracy, we'd be able to protect like trans people from the tyranny of the majority, right? Like that's I don't know. It's really disgusting to me. And Will Witt, I don't know. But you're welcome to come on the show anytime and defend yourself.
Hell yeah.
I don't love that. You might take away our dollars.
Yeah, well, that's the other thing. Is like, can we focus on that example? Like, what if, for instance, like, the two guys without dollars really needed those dollars for healthcare on the island that they're on, and there's no other like way to pay for it, and healthcare only costs like, let's say 25 cents for each of them. Democratically voting, if like that's your entire group, to redistribute is perfectly fine with me. Actually, I think it's 100% fair. I think like if you're just gonna say I'm gonna keep this dollar, and you're going to starve. If those are the stakes, which they are in real life, that's why we have people starving and like going in, like not getting medical care or going into medical debt, right? That's the real stakes. It's not this imaginary thing where a cameraman wants to shake you down. Like It's fair. It's perfectly understandable why you'd want democracy to be able to reduce those inequalities.
But I would also just add, on an individual level, which that's the character that all these people like the most, right? It's so funny how they become collectivists when it comes to the electoral college, but they're individualists in every other question. The electoral college is horrible for individuals because it prevents you from being able to express your vote, being able to express who you want to be the president, right? Because if you live in a red state, a state that's going to go red, you don't want to, you're going to feel like voting for Joe Biden or voting blue is a waste of time. The same way as voting for a Republican in a quote unquote blue state. The electoral college actually silences a significant amount of the population instead of allowing people to be able to voice their opinions, with the full weight that they want it to have. It's such a terrible argument on their point.
Also, like that, what is he going to Colorado in defense of the land? Like the people there decided to do that. Come on, mountains. Like this legislature wants to give up your power. Like what the hell are you talking about?
Exactly.
And then complaining it's cold. You're going to go to rural America, and the first thing you're going to say is like, it's really cold out here, guys. Like I don't know, who's the elitist?
It did look pretty cold.
That's Colorado. Come on. Like you don't go to Colorado expecting like wear shorts around.
LA weather.
Shall we get into the question of the evening?
I think so.
Let's do it. Do you want to introduce this for us, Leisha?
Yeah, I had the pleasure of speaking with Kristen Ghodsee, who is just such a brilliant mind and also just really fun and lovely to chat with. And she wrote the book Why Women Have Better Sex Under Socialism, which I hear is a favorite book of Sam Cedars. Matt told me that he just loves that argument. So yeah, please enjoy it. I think you guys will mostly be interested by Kristen speaking and me just taking notes. I'm here with Kristen Ghodsee, who is a professor of Russian and Eastern European Studies at the University of Pennsylvania. Her research focuses on gender, socialism, and post-socialism in Eastern Europe. Her articles and essays appear honestly everywhere: Foreign Affairs, The Washington Post, The New York Times, and Jacobin. And, she's written so many books that I couldn't even really figure out how many books she had written, and I had to clarify. There are 8 published and the 9th is on its way. Is that correct? Or is it 9 published and the 10th is
on its way?
I was looking at my notes. I was like, I think I fudged this figure. The book we're going to be discussing today is Why Women Have Better Sex Under Socialism and Other Arguments for Economic Independence. And you were just telling me right before we started recording that Why Women Have Better Sex Under Socialism has now been published in 13 countries.
Yeah, it's had 13 foreign editions. And really interestingly, I think for me at least, is that 5 of the translations are in countries that were previously socialist countries and state socialist countries in the 20th century. And so the feedback has been really fascinating, and especially from people in that part of the world. The book has just come out in Russian a couple weeks ago. And it's been really interesting to see the different international reactions. And in some ways, I feel like it sort of speaks to people's experience more profoundly outside of the United States, where they really have a much kind of more personal grasp of what socialism can and cannot do in society. So that's been a really interesting experience for me to actually be able to kind of not only think about the writing as it pertains to socialism in the United States, but also think about what it means for the rest of the world, because I had absolutely no idea when I wrote the book that it was going to be translated into other languages.
Right. And so much of the book you kind of are having to kind of fight against a lot of propaganda. Yeah. And, you kind of have to say, like, I'm not a Stalin apologist. I just want to say, like, there maybe me over here, there are a few things that were great that we could learn from, and maybe you don't have to put that caveat out in those other markets.
Absolutely. Yeah. I mean, when I originally started writing the book, the audience was very squarely kind of young American women who were sort of newly mobilized by the campaign of somebody like Bernie Sanders. You have to understand that when I submitted this manuscript in March of 2018, I believe nobody had even heard of Alexandria Ocasio-Cortez.
Wow.
And the Squad. And so, Bernie was very ascendant, but I have been thinking a lot about these issues. I've been teaching a class called Sex and Socialism at universities since 2003. So it's like 17 years I've been teaching this class. And I really wanted the book to be accessible to a wider audience. And so I really felt like I kind of needed to back up and explain things a lot more about what socialism is. And obviously for people who lived in Poland or the Czech Republic or the Soviet Union, they didn't need those basic explanations quite as much.
So back in the fall of Rome, contemporary America, I was curious if we could just kind of talk a little bit about a recent piece you wrote for the New York Times. The title is Women, Unpaid Labor is Worth $9 trillion, $9 million of American women earn a minimum wage for the unpaid work they do around the house and caring for relatives. They would have made $1.5 trillion last year. Can you talk a little bit about women's unpaid labor and how COVID-19 has impacted even those terrifying figures you referenced in that article?
Yeah, so that piece was done for International Women's Day earlier this year, like right before the pandemic hit. It was one of those weird graphic op-eds in the New York Times that I worked with a visual journalist there, a data journalist named Gus Bezarek. And what we basically looked at was this Oxfam report that had come out. And we also looked at some OECD data on paid versus unpaid labor. And essentially what we found was that, concurring with the Oxfam report, that globally in 1 year, I think 2018, if women had been paid for their unpaid labor at like minimum wage, the figure would have been $10.9 trillion, okay, of
I couldn't
value.
even get that figure out. I was looking at the numbers and I was like, oh God.
Yeah, it's a lot of zeros. Yeah, there's so many zeros there. It's actually kind of hard to understand how much women's unpaid labor contributes to the global economy because we just don't value it. And then that figure for the United States in 2018 was 1.5 trillion. But the key thing was that if you added up the total of the global Fortune 500 list of companies, it was less than women's unpaid labor. That was the point of that article, to show how incredibly valuable this labor is. And so when you come from a kind of left perspective, one of the things that we argue, especially when we talk about socialist feminism, is precisely that women's unpaid labor is a subsidy to capital. Like capital and employers, owners of the quote unquote means of production, right, no matter how amorphous those are able to keep wages down because they don't have to pay for the services that women provide in reproducing the labor force, taxpayers, soldiers, citizens, so on and so forth. And so that's been a long-standing critique of capitalism from the left, is that women's unpaid labor is sort of like this hidden subsidy. And so when we did that piece for International Women's Day this year, it was, like I said, it was before the pandemic. And so we were really just thinking about, how could we value this labor? How can we get people to pay attention to all of the unpaid labor that women do? And that number is really interesting because it's actually an underestimation, because on the first place, it values that labor at minimum wage. And everybody knows that a lot of this labor, like nursing and caring and childcare, is worth a lot more. It can be paid a lot more than minimum wage. But also, it doesn't take into account the Oxfam report takes all of the unpaid labor in an economy and then just divided it in half between men and women. But in fact, if we look at the OECD data, which is available on the web openly, you can see that in fact there's a huge discrepancy between men's unpaid labor and women's unpaid labor. Women do a lot more unpaid labor, not surprisingly, than men do. And so if you actually corrected for all of that, the figure would be much higher. And so the argument of that piece was that, look, we can actually see that in countries with larger social safety nets, not surprisingly places like countries in Scandinavia, the gap between men and women's unpaid labor is less. And again, this was all before the pandemic. Now that all the schools are closed and all the daycares are closed, what we're realizing is that women provide an incredible service to our economy in so many ways. And the traditional kind of liberal feminist way of dealing with women's labor in the home is to commercialize it. And so we go out into the market and we essentially pay other women to do our labor for us. We pay other women usually minority women, people of color, to clean our houses, to look after our children, to take care of our elderly parents. But in the pandemic, what we've seen is that that whole model has broken apart. The marketization of women's, the kind of commodification of women's unpaid labor just doesn't really work. It needs to be socialized. It needs to be spread more evenly throughout society through things like subsidized childcare, through, kind of a more robust, inclusive healthcare system where every citizen has healthcare not as a citizen and not as an employee, and so on and so forth. So what we're seeing, there's this McKinsey report that just came out in conjunction with the Lean In Foundation. Something like, I think they estimate almost 2 million women are going to leave the corporate workforce because of the challenges and stresses placed on them during the coronavirus pandemic for all this care work that they have to do at home. And so it's a bad situation. And I think that what it shows very clearly is that markets alone cannot solve the problem of women's unpaid labor. It's not enough to commodify it. It needs to be supported more socially through taxation and redistribution, or other ways of generating revenue, collective ownership of the means of production, for instance. One of the chapters in the book is called Pantsuits Are Not Enough.
Yes.
In that chapter, I really try to unpack why it is that this sort of liberal feminism, lean-in feminism, girl boss feminism, whatever you want to call it, the socialists used to call it bourgeois feminism back in the late 19th century. That sort of strand of feminism was always about getting women things like voting rights through the suffragettes, getting women, married women, property rights, allowing women access to higher education, and allowing women access to previously male professions. And so that version of women's activism was always really about privileged women. It was always really about the daughters of those with property, the wealthy daughters being really angry that when they got married, all of their wealth was immediately transferred to the pockets of their husbands, who could spend it at will, as many of them did. And there were, all of these rules, excluding women from obviously voting, but also excluding women from professions, no matter how talented they were. And I think it's really important to understand that when we look at the history of women's activism in the late 19th century, and we go back to somebody like Flora Tristan, who was writing in like 1838, 1840, her final book is 1843, what you see is that there was this whole other strand of feminism, which was really about understanding that working women, that peasant women, that ordinary women needed to build a coalition with men, with workers from the bottom up, and really kind of transform society together, rather than just imagining that having some elite role models, like having a female president or a female CEO or some, girl boss sort of thing, that top down kind of trickle down idea of like, well, if we just have a few women in power, they're going to make us, it's going to be good for all of us. It's not, right? What it means is it's good for them. It's always been good for them, and it's not good for ordinary women. And so I think that when we go back and we really understand the longer history and trajectory of what is called socialist feminism, clearly it was a much more inclusive and broad-based movement. Now, it has its problems. I'm not trying to sugarcoat it. There are things about it. Some people say that it can be very essentializing. It tends to overemphasize women's roles as mothers and caregivers. But at the end of the day, whether you agree with women's roles, being defined by motherhood or not, a lot of women are mothers and a lot of women are caregivers. And at least this model is not just focused on getting a few women ahead at the top. It's about creating a society which is much more just and equitable and sustainable for everybody, not just for a few elite women at the top. And I think that's really important.
Absolutely. I think we've teased everyone long enough, and we need to get to the question. But, I think contextualizing the current state of, unpaid women's labor in the U.S. and just kind of making that differentiation around like a token lady boss at top versus a coalition of working women coming together across all spheres of society is important to kind of set the ground for why women have better sex under socialism.
Right. Yeah. So, I want to just sort of stop for a second and kind of unpack like how that book even came about.
Oh,
Because I think
please.
that's an interesting story as well. And then the argument sort of makes a little bit more sense in context. So as I said, I've been teaching this class called Sex and Socialism since 2003. And I've written 6 books about gender and socialism specifically, and post-socialism, looking at the ways in which the status of women changed between 1989 in Eastern Europe and 1991 in the Soviet Union and the present day and what happened afterwards. So as a social scientist, when you are interested in testing a theory, like how are women's lives and even women's sex lives going to be affected by an economic system? This is not an easy experiment to do, because it's like, I can't take a bunch of girls and put them in a lab and grow one group up under capitalism and the other group up under socialism and then see how their sex lives change or how their personal lives are different. That's an unethical study. And not to mention, it's kind of impossible to do because you can't do that. So you look for what's called a natural experiment. And the natural experiment here is clearly that you had a bunch of countries in Eastern Europe, which were socialist for a long time, 70 years in the Soviet Union, about 45 years in Eastern Europe. And then it ended and they became capitalist. And so, wow, as a social scientist, I'm an ethnographer, and I say, this is the perfect natural experiment to show me how political economic systems impact women's rights. This is so important because there's empirical data here. You can actually see, how did women fare economically, politically, sociologically? There are all sorts of things that you could study. And you can also study sexologically, how did people's relationships change? And so the way that this book came about was that I published a book in 2017 called Red Hangover, which was a sort of retrospective book looking at the legacies of the Bolshevik Revolution 100 years after that revolution. And in that chapter, in that book, there was a chapter called Gross Domestic Orgasms. And it was essentially a kind of discussion of a lecture that I had given in Freiburg in what was West Germany in, I think it was 2014 or 2015, about all of this really interesting sexological research around whether or not East German women had more orgasms than West German women, which was a very, very touchy topic. There was a wonderful documentary film called Do Communists Have Better Sex that I was basically showing clips from, and then my job was to sort of lead a discussion. That was all I was supposed to do. And talk about the kind of research that had been done in places like Poland and Czechoslovakia around issues of sexuality. And my West German audience, mostly men, were really uncomfortable and really, really unhappy with the nature of this discussion. So I wrote an essay about it, which became a chapter in this book, which then became the August 2017 New York Times op-ed, Why Women Had Better Sex Under Socialism. And that just kind of blew up in my face. There were all sorts of ways in which I was really not expecting whatsoever the reaction that I got. I actually didn't think what I was saying was all that controversial, because in my world, it's a fairly accepted truism that socialist countries were generally pretty progressive on women's rights. Especially at a much earlier stage than the United States or many West European countries. I can give you all sorts of examples of this, but it's generally kind of recognized that the Eastern Bloc countries really committed to promoting women's education, women's professional opportunities, women's economic independence, women's sexual autonomy, and so on and so forth, far earlier than places like the United States or West Germany or the United Kingdom. But boy, as you can imagine, people in the United States were not really happy about this.
I mean, you hit like the two biggest triggers for a lot of people in the U.S., which is, communism, socialism, sex,
and
arguably,
right, exactly. And so, boy, this is what happens, I think, when you spend way too much time as an academic working in your own little field and not really engaging with the wider world around you. I was just sort of blown away by that. So the book was the product of essentially me getting a call from a New York publishing house saying, hey, can you make this op-ed into a book? And I was very reluctant to do so at first because I was an academic and I'd never written for a popular audience, and I wasn't sure that I had the chops to kind of like make that move. But I thought it was really important. And I did really feel, because I have, like I said, been teaching this class for 17 years, more or less, that there are these really important arguments that a lot of people don't realize about how women's economic independence impacts our personal lives. So, feminists like to say that the personal is political. And I, in the book, try to invert that and say that the political is personal. But even more so, I want to argue that the pleasureful is political. There's a direct line between what's happening in the political economic system under which we live and the way that it impacts our personal lives. I mean, it's ridiculous to think that that's not true, that you close the door to your bedroom and somehow all of the world disappears and it's just like you and your partner or partners in your intimate relationships. That's just not reality. So the argument in the book, first of all, there are, I think, 6 chapters in the book, and only 2 of them deal with sex, right? So there's one on motherhood, there's one on leadership, there's one on citizenship, there's one on work, but there are 2 on sex. And those are the ones that everybody wants to talk about because everybody likes to talk about sex, right? Yeah. So the argument is very simple. It's that when you live in a society with greater social safety nets, where women are not forced or compelled in some way to exchange not only their emotions and their affections, but also their physical intimacy in exchange for somebody who can pay the rent or somebody who can support them and their children, women are going to have greater levels of economic independence, which means very simply that they're going to choose their partners. And I am very specifically in this book talking about heterosexual relationships. They're going to choose their partners on the basis of mutual attraction, mutual affection, mutual interests, and love, because they're not going to feel compelled to marry somebody just because, or to be with somebody just because that person has access to resources that woman otherwise wouldn't have. And so that's a hypothesis that can be empirically tested. And what I do in the book is I basically try to present the evidence of those empirical tests to the extent that they exist. I take this idea of sexual economics theory and I try to apply it empirically to the situation in Eastern Europe as it transitioned from being a socialist state command economy to a democratic free market economy, and what happened to the status of women and to their intimate personal relationships over the last 30 years.
Yeah, and the book is so wonderful. I was acknowledging you for this when we got on this morning. I like anything that makes socialist ideas and just general kind of imagining of what society could be. And, if we have the heart and the brain power to make things shift and better for people, your writing is just so refreshing to me because it's interesting and it's personal and it's funny and it's sarcastic. Early on when I was, I can't remember if I was waitressing or nannying, but there was this wealthy woman I was working for. And I remember her saying something about, she wanted something from her husband. And she was like, okay, well, on Saturday night when I have him in the right position, I'll ask. Oh. And I was so shocked. And I think I would have kind of rolled my eyes at I think you used the alias Lisa or something. There's a chapter you talk about the woman who's, kind of upper middle class. Her husband doesn't want her to work. She stays at home with the kids. And, she basically, you overhear a conversation where, she doesn't have money to go out. She wants to go clothes shopping. And the husband says, you blew all the money buying things for the kids and the house, you can't make more money. And I think I kind of would have been like, yeah, right. Had it not been for this, right. This comment that I heard when I was 18 or 19 that really shocked me. And then again, another story I'm going to pull from the book because I think it's important to underline. There's a professor friend of yours who has, I think, accidentally has twins, has a toddler and then has 3 kids under 4, some kind of child care financial, catastrophe. But also if there's just one kid would be, incredibly expensive as well. And she doesn't want to sacrifice her career. So she makes something like 70 cents a year after paying for child care and continuing to work for 4 or 5 years. And then her kids can go to maybe public school, offsets that cost. And she hasn't, she's still on the track for tenure, or, continuing to work. So I just love those very real grounded examples because then it's not so theoretical. It's not so women in the U.S. you don't know the reality. We can work. We don't have to stay home. You can be a mom. You can do it all. Is so the mentality now, and that's just not the economic reality.
Yeah.
And so, I appreciate you kind of putting in these like very real and grounded anecdotes. Would you mind explaining, because I hadn't come across this before I read your book, sexual economic theory, what that term is, and how it can be co-opted?
Yeah. So it's really important to understand that this theory, it's sort of been appropriated by conservative right in this country for somewhat nefarious ends. Within social psychology, in 2003, there was this paper by Baumeister and Vose called Sexual Economics Theory. And essentially what they argue is that in the heterosexual courtship market, women sell their sexuality for sometimes non-monetary goods. So support, marriage, whatever, good grades, it doesn't necessarily mean like a direct monetary transaction. It means this sort of indirect transaction. So that what they argue in the book, in that article, is that when the price of sex is high, meaning that when women don't have opportunities outside of marriage, right? So in societies where women don't get educated, women don't have professional opportunities, and the only way for them to survive, to actually put food on the table and pay the rent and feed their kids, is to transact a marriage bargain whereby they trade their sexuality and their reproductive capacity in exchange for a male support. The price of sex is really high. Like, women essentially don't have sex unless marriage is the price. In a society where women have lots of opportunities, and the paradigmatic example, of course, is going to be in places like Denmark and Sweden, where women have not only professional opportunities and education, but there's also a really robust social safety net so that their children will be educated, so that they'll have access to healthcare, so that they will be, okay without a partner, without a husband, or somebody to take care of them, kind of a patron, so to speak, a patriarch. The price of sex is low, because women will have sex with whoever they want to have sex with, because they're not using it as a tool to meet their basic needs. And so Baumeister and Vose are very careful to kind of create an economic model. They basically take economics and they apply it to social psychology. And it's important to understand that within social psychology, their model has been deeply and profoundly criticized because they make these weird assumptions that I think don't actually bear out in reality. They assume that women have lower levels of libido naturally somehow than men do, that women are more willing in some ways to use sex as a tool, but they completely ignore the sort of sociological and societal pressures on women to sort of walk that fine line between slut and prude, so to speak, that controls women's sexuality. And they don't really try to go back and say, okay, what is some sort of natural state of female sexuality? They just ignore that question altogether. What's really interesting is that conservatives in this country have used this sexual economics theory as a way of blaming women for all of the kind of men who are failing to launch, and are sort of living, in their parents' houses and not really getting jobs because the price of sex, women are too emancipated, so the price of sex is too low. If the price of sex was higher, then somehow American men would get their, crap together and they'd be able to go out and get jobs because they would want to have it's this
interesting
really
how they suddenly
thing.
Care about data.
Yeah, it's and there's an interesting video that you can watch upon this. So I was really curious about this argument because, unbeknownst in some ways to Baumeister and Vose, who wrote this paper in 2003, they were essentially recapitulating 150 years of socialist theory about sexual and love and family relationships under capitalism. Wow. So what I pointed out in the book is that if you actually go back and you read socialist theorists like Friedrich Engels or August Bebel or Alexandra Kollontai, who actually write specifically about the family and sexuality and love, especially Kollontai. Kollontai here is a really key figure. It's almost as if they're admitting that love under capitalism is transactional, and it always will be because we live in a market economy. And what they don't say, but what you can easily infer from that article, and by the way, there are subsequent studies where they try to provide empirical data for their claims. So there's I think Baumeister and Mendoza do a paper where they actually look at an independent measure of women's economic independence, and they correlate it with a sex survey that Playboy did or something like that about sexual practices. And they find very clearly that in societies where women have really high level of economic independence, that, people tend to have sex earlier, they have sex more often, that it's basically a much more sexually liberated society. In societies where women have almost no economic independence outside of marriage, then there's very, very little sex going on. And it's usually sex that's going on in marriage. And of course, this is exactly what conservatives love about this. So if you take away all of women's rights, you take away their education, their opportunities for getting ahead professionally, if you outlaw abortion and if you outlaw birth control, boom, you can go back to a world in which men have all the power and the price of sex is really high. So what I loved about this, again, as somebody sitting outside steeped in 150 years of socialist theory about women's rights and sexuality and socialist theories of love, kind of a dialectical materialist analysis of love and how love might change, is that essentially what Baumeister and Vose say, and subsequently through their empirical studies suggest and support, is this idea that we would all have better relationships under socialism because they would be less transactional.
Yeah.
They would actually be more authentic. They would be more based on love and mutual attraction and affection, which is exactly what Kollontai was writing about in the 1920s, than they are under capitalism, where everything, our affections, emotions, and attentions, become commodities to be traded with prices determined by the vicissitudes of supply and demand. And I think that is something that we really need to think about, because it's really revolutionary. When you start to apply that to your own life, how can you decommodify yourself? How you can decommodify your relationships? It can be extremely empowering.
Yeah. And I liked how you kind of just gave like a very simple example, because I think, we can kind of get lost in, well, if you're paying a woman for sex, and that could be like literally paying a woman for sex, or it could be more like paying rent, food, whatever, is your concern going to be her pleasure? Or is it kind of like, okay, I've compensated this person, so yes, I'm going to get off. And then you kind of make the example of like, if you pay someone to clean your house, like you're not going to be that concerned of like, oh, like I really hope she enjoyed cleaning my house. I notice I do say she, because most people who clean houses are she. Right. And, versus being like, yeah, she got paid to clean my house. I don't care, if she enjoyed it or not, especially in the context of capitalism. If you pay someone for something, you're not too caught up in the other emotional aspects, which is a whole other problem.
Absolutely. Yeah. I think that the one thing is that it's important to point out that in the book, like there are these anecdotes, right? There are these very grounded examples. And I want to say that a lot of those examples come from teaching.
Yeah.
Right? Because I have to talk about these theories in class with undergraduates between the ages of 18 and 22 who may not know the history of socialism or socialist women's rights or socialist feminism or even, broader sort of theories of political economy. And so it's really useful as somebody who has been teaching for it's kind of embarrassing, about 21 years now.
That's great. That's not embarrassing. It's wonderful.
To say, to be able to kind of give people very concrete examples of what this looks like. And so, sometimes the anecdotes, I feel like those are really important because they allow people to kind of understand the personal stories behind the theories. And in the book, I want to not only, appeal to people or reach people intellectually. I think that's important too, but I also feel like it's really important to make these theories relatable, to appeal to people's emotional understanding. And as you were saying, when you're an 18-year-old and you heard this woman, basically saying, when I get the guy in the right position, then I can ask for whatever it is I want. I think there are a lot of women in that situation that don't want to admit it. But there are a lot of women in extremely precarious positions in this country, even around something as simple as healthcare. If you get your healthcare through your spouse's employer, you cannot get divorced without losing your healthcare.
Right. And
this puts people in an incredibly precarious position, again, especially during a pandemic. Right now, the New York Times did an article I think a week or two ago, about the coronavirus divorce rate,
Yeah.
right? Which is that like a lot of women are waking up to the fact that their marriages are really unhealthy or unhappy or abusive. And yet at the same time, as much as they might want to get a divorce, many of them can't if they're getting their health care through their husband's employer. Because you don't want to lose healthcare during a pandemic, you know? So you have this terrible dilemma. I think a lot of women in the United States are facing this right now. There's so much going on that's terrible. But one of the many terrible things is that you have women that are being trapped in relationships because they have to choose between maintaining a relationship with somebody that they're no longer in love with, who may be treating them very badly. We also know the domestic violence rates have gone through the roof, or losing access to healthcare in case they get sick during what is an international pandemic. It's pretty horrific if you think about it, in a country that's supposedly like the land of the quote unquote free.
Yeah, it's really sick. So speaking of controlling women's bodies and, you know, labor, and quickly before we move on, the anecdotes I think are just so helpful, because when people tune in to us, they're obviously like a lot of, you know, brilliant, you know, fellow scholars and intellectuals and people who have really spent, you know, years and careers researching this. But we also go on YouTube and people can just come across this. So, you know, there are many virtual students out there as well. So, you know, I always kind of like to hold both. But one thing I just wanted to kind of touch on before we wrap this up was I really was interested in the book, how you talked about why, you know, making women have only one sexual partner and be in monogamous marriage is directly tied towards legitimate heirs and land ownership. And could you just speak a little bit about that connection?
Yeah, sure. I mean, obviously, this goes back to Friedrich Engels, The Origin of the Family and Private Property in the State, where he basically argues that the bourgeois monogamous nuclear family, this idea of women being the property of their husbands, is the institutional base in society for the intergenerational transfer of private property. So the reason that men want to control women's sexuality, basically why women can't cheat on their husbands, but men can cheat wherever, you know, there's always been this double standard, is because men want to ensure the paternity of their children. And the only way to do that is to control their wives' sexuality. And the reason that paternity is so important is precisely because the intergenerational transfer of wealth has to happen to a legitimate heir. Now, if you think back to the Bolshevik Revolution, one of the first things that happens in the Soviet Union is that they abolished the distinction between legitimate and illegitimacy, right? So a child born out of wedlock, so to speak, is considered illegitimate or a bastard child, right? Which meant, and what that meant was a property relationship. That child had no access to the wealth of the father, whereas a legitimate child was a legitimate heir. So what it shows us very clearly is that marriage is an institution for the preservation of property. It is an institution that allows for the intergenerational transfer of property. I mean, I recently heard a figure about the trillions of dollars in the next 20 years that young Americans, a certain group of young Americans are going to inherit from their parents, right? Mm-hmm. So we're essentially going back to a kind of hereditary aristocracy in this country based on this intergenerational transfer of wealth. And a lot of that is based on this particular institution of marriage and the way that it has been formulated over the years. And so I do think that reimagining the family, broadening our definition of the family, broadening our definition of our kin relations is really essential to pushing back against capitalism. It's not only about the property, it's also about the family, because that family is the institution that allows for that intergenerational transfer, that perpetuates inequality, both racial and class inequality from generation to generation.
Well, I just so appreciate the work you're doing. I'm going to give a final plug to your podcast, because you've mentioned Kollontai a few times. I check out AK-47, which is 47 readings from Alexandra Kollontai. I think I'm on about episode 30. They're great. I'm speeding through them. I hope that this is the first of many conversations we have, and I just so appreciate your time and your work.
Thank you so much for inviting me on the show. It's been a pleasure. I'm sorry for my deep, dark basement. This is
I
the
think it's
best
very
I can
chic,
do.
very bohemian. I don't think there are any apologies necessary.
Yeah, I was trying to like put up cloth to make the sound less echoey. So that's why you see all these random
You
bits
nailed it.
of fabric everywhere.
Oops. Yeah. So, wow, that is a very good explanation for having all that cloud, because it does cut down on echo to have that stuff hanging up.
It's true.
That was your takeaway.
Yeah. I was just impressed. I was just impressed that she was conscious of that, to be honest. But also, Alicia, great job. That was a great interview.
You know, Colin Ty, you know what her autobiography was called?
I do not.
It's
but
a great.
I know that Miss Ghodsee does.
Oh, for sure. It's just a great title. It's the autobiography of a sexually emancipated communist woman.
I love it.
No,
Yeah.
she's an incredible figure.
Yeah. I've discovered her through Kristen's work, and I know I already plugged it, but Kristen Ghodsee is also so clever with her titles. I love that she calls it AK-47.
That's really good.
So, David, do you want to get to the gem?
Yeah. Well, it's hard to go from something that is pretty positive to, well, I don't know. Let's be sympathetic. Honestly, you know, we're all going through a pandemic, and during a period like this, you know, we need to have a lot of empathy for other people and to put ourselves in other shoes. And who will think of the executives who have been struggling during these unprecedented times?
Thank you.
You know,
You mean in like a sympathetic way?
yeah. I mean, you know,
I'm thinking about them.
At times where they're seeing all of their metrics because of this loss of profitability because of the COVID crisis, you know, their bonuses are in danger because they're not able to hit the kind of typical metrics that they would in a year to get the massive bonuses that they enjoy. Most years, well, worry not. This is coming from the Financial Times. Companies are rewriting bonus plans, switching performance metrics, and ignoring missing targets so that executives do not suffer a big drop in pay as a result of the COVID-19 crisis. Changes that could become controversial with shareholders in the months ahead. This story really is just about the complete rot of the American corporate structure. Now, obviously, we don't like any structure that is set up to exploit workers, but you have to understand just how nasty the American corporate structure has become since the 70s towards the benefit of the executives and primarily toward the shareholders of companies. So basically what they're doing is if you're an executive, you get a period, significant amount of your money is tied up in stock so that you're always worried about shareholders first and what would make shareholders happy first. And that's one problem in and of itself. And then also, you have certain milestones that you have to hit during the year, making so much money for the company. Well, what they've done is they've shifted that around so that the changes are now including things like they're excluding entire months. So basically the entire COVID crisis from people's review, and they're adding all of these non-financial measures to compensation packages. But what's worrying the most for the average person here is that these companies are setting up their pay packages, their bonus packages for executives to encourage them to save as much money as possible rather than increase earnings. It's a scary metric given the likely longevity of this crisis and the fact that when we're talking about saving money, that primarily means slashing wages and making sure that people don't get any kind of bonus or raise. It's a completely rotten system. We know that. But it's going to be very interesting if you, as the Financial Times section that I put up earlier, sort of highlighted, if there actually is going to be a tension between shareholders and executives who have basically over the past 50 years of capitalism, as capitalism has become more and more exploitive, there has actually been like a very significant merging of the executive branch of these corporations and the shareholders because so much of their pay is tied up to, shareholder earnings. But obviously, this is definitely going to come on the backs of workers for the most part. Another thing that's very worrying about this situation, especially as we're talking about all of these savings that they're trying to push executives to pursue, is coming after a period, and Matt will know this because I did so many gems on it, I felt like almost every other week, was about the explosion of corporate debt that we saw over 2018, 2019, that's seeing these companies massively in debt because money was so cheap. And now they're sort of being pressured to cut more and more of their costs during a pandemic where they're going to see their revenue dropping significantly, especially given the fact that it looks like our government is going to completely fail again to provide any kind of stimulus. So it's just another great example of the fact that we have very plastic rules in the so-called rational system for those at the top and very hard lines for those at the bottom.
You're saying that Lady Queen Nancy Pelosi won't be saving us?
Well, we'll have to get to that in a second.
I think we should get to that right now.
Yeah, we got it right now. Good morning, Sunday morning. Good morning.
Oh, goodness gracious. Okay, so here it is. This is just, I haven't watched this full interview yet because I'm not sure exactly. This was 2:30 today. Okay, so, I mean, this will give you enough of a gist of it. Here's Nancy Pelosi with Wolf Blitzer.
Madam Nancy Pelosi.
Their proposal either. But let's not go into that. You evidently do not respect the chairman of the committees who wrote these bills.
I respect
and
all of you.
I wish you would respect the knowledge that goes into getting meeting the needs of the American people. But again, you've been on JAG defending the administration all this time with no knowledge of the difference between our two bills. And I thank you for giving me the opportunity to say that to you in person.
Right, Madam Speaker, these are...
Now, I want to stop here just to say, like, I am not myself super familiar with the difference between the two bills. I think Trump's is 1.8 trillion and Pelosi's is 2.2 trillion. Now, I'm not certain on the sticks of this. I'm purely reacting to this on this is not what we need the leadership of the Democrats to be doing on television right now. Like, I do not, and like, I have no confidence in her to play this correctly. So anyways, I just wanted to say that up front.
These are incredibly difficult times right now, and we'll leave it on that note. Thank you so much for joining
us. We'll leave it on the vote that you are not right on this, Wolf. I say that to you. But I feel confident about it, and I feel confident about my colleagues, and I feel confidence in my chairs.
And it's not about me. It's about millions of Americans who can't put food on the table, who can't pay the rent,
and we represent them. And we represent them.
Getting by these long food lines that we're seeing. I know you are. We know them. I'm just saying.
We represent them, and we know them.
As we say,
know them. We represent them.
Don't let the perfect be the enemy of the good, as they say.
It is nowhere near perfect.
Madam Speaker.
Always the case, but we're not even close to the good.
All right, let's see what happens, because every day is critically, critically important. Thanks so much for joining us.
Thank you for your sensitivity to our constituents' needs.
Oh, my God.
I am sensitive to them because I see them on the street begging for food, begging for money.
Good for him.
Have you fed them? We feed them. We feed them.
We'll continue this conversation down the road for sure. We'll take a quick break. We'll be right back.
Yeah, man, that's horrific stuff. It's been so. I mean,
you're missing the takeaway. She didn't let him interrupt her.
Oh, that's true.
Yeah,
So that's what I got from that.
Yeah, one of the most powerful people in this country is really holding their ground. They're from.
Pass it on.
This is the scariest attack Trump has on the Democrats and Biden. And it's like, you've been here for so long. Why didn't you take care of it? Right? Like, we feed them. Yeah. We have a child hunger in this problem that's been there the entire time she's been in office.
Or the fact that, I'm sorry, like, I don't know, maybe you'll have different takes on this, but at this point, the dire needs of so many people to basically have some kind of stimulus. If you can get a $1,200 check to people immediately, I think that's worth doing. I agree that, like, you have to push back because the Republicans basically, I mean, their bill is it's not adequate, especially when it comes to helping people at the bottom of the pay scale. But if you can get people $1,200 right now, that's huge. I mean, that will make a massive difference in people's lives. And I think standing in the way of that because you think that you're going to be able to hold out and basically leverage Mitch McConnell.
And the problem is the time to hold out was earlier at the start of this. And she says, trust me, we'll do this later. And now's not the time.
And we're a couple of weeks from the election at this point.
Exactly. Well,
and it's a great attack line. It's a great attack line for Trump to use. I mean, I've been just sort of trolling around and talking to some of my friends from, where I come from, which is like, a little bit of a different community than, the kind of Brooklyn community or the people who I know who like went to university, right? Like these are my like friends who are just working class people, high school educated. And there's a very strong awareness right now that Donald Trump is trying to get them $1,200 a month. I mean, a check for $1,200,
right?
And that the Democrats are stepping in the way of it. We can talk about whatever narrative we want in the New York Times and have like opinion polls. Opinion pieces about the Republicans are so awful. Absolutely, I agree with that 100%. But what's becoming very the popular narrative right now is that there's a plan to get people another stimulus check, and the Democrats are refusing to play ball. Right? If you don't want to play ball, you have to be able to change the narrative, right? You have to be able to explain why you're doing what you're doing. And that kind of behavior, that kind of performance that we saw from Nancy Pelosi is not doing it. It's really despicable, especially knowing what we know is this coming avalanche of pain and suffering after months and months of pain and suffering. But as this economic situation continues to get worse, as we see unemployment benefits dry up, and yes, that's a Republican problem. That's something that the Republicans did. But you can't allow the Republicans to basically undermine you left and right, and then allow them to present the story that they're presenting now, that you're actually the people who are standing in the way of another round of stimulus.
Here's a little bit more just to get a bit more of this interview.
Mr. Speaker, these are incredibly difficult times right now, and we'll leave it on that note. Thank you so much for joining.
Oh wait, sorry, that's the same part we saw. But I mean, I thought that was a part where she like kind of downplayed Ro Khan's as support of it, and I don't know. It's like, the frustrating thing about her putting herself in this position, and all of us in this position, where we don't have the leverage right now, and it's like, I don't know. Giving Trump a win, honestly, you should be able to beat Trump even if you give people checks right now.
Mm-hmm.
Like,
I mean, at that point, this is just sort of is becoming a need. It's like something that you can't throw away,
right?
Because I'll tell you what's not going to happen. Trump loses and on November 5th starts releasing stimulus checks. Those next ones are going to be an absolute disaster.
Yeah.
So if you can get this to people now, I don't feel like
he's so fucking vindictive.
No, of course, and he's despicable, and I know some people are going to get mad at us for saying this. Like, we're not ignoring the reality of the fact that the GOP is like the main force right here that's obstructing the basic kind of need and the basic kind of package that needs to happen. But what we're trying to say is that there is a massive need for some action, and you need to figure out a way. Yes, it's difficult, but it's very possible. It's a lot more possible than they're making it out to be able to get some people some relief now instead of punting for 5 months. And Nancy Pelosi saying like she knows these people, she represents them. That is such BS. That is somebody
she feeds them.
I mean, it's despicable to even say that. They feed her.
It's pretty horrible.
They feed her. Her whole life is sitting, her bloated life is sitting on top of the backs of thousands of millions of people who work every day.
Extremely unequal district. Here's this. I said it was Cuomo last week, but this is this interview with Tapper from when she was negotiating away CARES without making this $1,200 should have been an installment. She could have locked it in then when you were giving away all the money to the corporations, and we wouldn't.
And to the lobbyists too. Don't forget the Democrats put that in there. Make sure K Street gets bailed out.
And we would not be having this discussion. And frankly, the attitude toward Democrats might be really effing good right now, because this thing would have been continued. And okay, like maybe Trump would put his name on it. You'd have been the one who made him make it recurring, and you could run on that. Anyway, here's what she told Tapper I guess this was it was several months ago at the start of this.
Major concession on the most. You and Senator Schumer made this major concession on the most recent legislation. You made it okay in this one.
It wasn't a concession.
No, well, I mean, New York Governor Andrew Cuomo.
I understand what Andrew Cuomo said, and I respect his perspective as always an interim bill.
Nice edit.
Was this a tactical mistake by you and Senator Schumer?
Just calm down. We will have state and local, and we will have it in a very significant way. We made Let me recap this for you. The governors are in.
I appreciate this.
I'm a big fan of Governor Cuomo, my own governor. Gavin Newsom is spectacular.
Vice President Joe Biden's campaign told me earlier this month that he supported President Trump's partial travel restrictions on January 30th.
Yeah, okay. So that's her, saying, trust me, right? And guess what? Look at where we're at. Yeah, just calm down.
Just calm down.
This is just not the time to be calm, man.
And then what was her appearance after that? Going on James Corden showing off her ice cream fridge. Mm-hmm. Yeah, you really represent the people that are begging for food, Nancy. Yeah, that's plausible.
But this is the reality. They know that they don't have to play for working people. Their fixation, the people that they're trying to win over, the people that they're trying to attract, is this kind of upper middle class professional voter, the suburban voter, who is going to love the gotcha. Like, oh, actually Donald Trump, his plan doesn't do this and that, right? The people whose needs are very different from somebody who really is going paycheck to paycheck right now and is struggling, right? Somebody who wants these kind of gotcha moments when people really just are demanding, like, will you go into Congress and demand and fight and win the bare minimum necessity that people in this country are facing.
I mean, talk about playing with fire. Like standing in the way of when people aren't able to pay their rent.
Literally in California, playing with fire.
Really, I mean, it's scary.
It's really dark. I think we should start plugging things that we're not actually going to do in the post game, like how they used to do in Arrested Development.
One thing we are going to get to is we're going to play a Vic Berger edit of a Baked Alaska. He's harassing people in stores, employees, for enforcing mask mandates, and then the cops show up, and it's very funny to watch how a little crypto reactionary like Baked Alaska or I don't know if that'd be the correct term from crypto, but
for sure.
It's funny to see them just fold right as soon as the cops.
It's sad, honestly.
It's
sad to see that whole industry. No, we should save our commentary for the clip. Did we want to do SCOTUS stuff in the post game too?
Do a quick SCOTUS thing now.
I mean, look, I'm not one of these people who's going to watch the theater. Matt, the only thing I'd like to pull up is this very last tweet that I have. I'll highlight it for you. I don't need it up just a second, but I'm not somebody who's very interested in theater. I know I should because this is what we do, but I'm not really interested in watching the hearings. I've seen a little bit of them.
Can I make a quick point on that, which is kind of just to retake Sam's point, which is that if the position is these are like a sham, then the Democrats shouldn't even be going to them. And you want to make a statement, make a statement. But going through this form, this rote thing, all of a sudden it's so clear. What's so infuriating about the Democrats is they just play this up for they get emails. What's her name? Christine Blasey Ford was a sacrifice to get emails because the Democrats weren't really coming from Kavanaugh. Because all you need to do is search Kavanaugh and then closed session for the Senate because they left all the juicy stuff behind that. And then they brought in Christine Blasey Ford, frankly, too late in the process to really do anything except get people really animated for that process and for the midterms later. And it was cynical and it was sickening, honestly, because I actually believe Ford. I don't think she was lying. I think, frankly, the Kavanaugh's calendar implicated him.
Oh yeah.
But she was never she was put in a position. Like I said, she was a sacrifice to get emails. Anyway.
Yeah, I got an email from Nancy Pelosi being like, "Give me $5 and I'll tell you what a devil's triangle is." That night.
But yeah, I mean, look, this is such a scam. I do think it is important though to talk about a SCOTUS strategy. It's something that's been something that I've been fixated on for a long time because it's going to be a problem for any kind of socialist politics in this country. So we do need to have a SCOTUS strategy. What we're seeing right now from the Democratic Party has been quite, toothless, unfortunately. And I don't think they're going to play the kind of dirty game that they would need to play to be able to shut down and stop this nomination from going through. It just should be noted again that originalism, the judicial philosophy that Amy Coney Barrett subscribes to is a complete sham. I mean, it's just an excuse to hide her nasty conservative views. I think it's worth noting, though, her ruling on race discrimination in the workplace, along with all of the other horrible rulings that she's done on abortion and voting rights, where she argued that basically there was a worker who he was a transportation employee who was called the N-word by his employer. And Barrett actually said She does admit that the N-word, this is a direct quote from her, she does admit this, the N-word is an egregious racial epithet. That said, Smith, the gentleman who was called the N-word, can't win simply by proving that the word was uttered. He must also demonstrate that his boss's use of the word altered the conditions of his employment and created a hostile or abusive working environment. I mean, just understand that this is the kind of person who is now going to be deciding major cases. Not that the people who are already on the Supreme Court, by the way, are a cotton cloth above her. But this is definitely a dark moment. Not for that institution, because that institution is quite reactionary, but this is definitely
it's a shining moment for the institution.
Yeah, honestly, it just is like a return to its proper roots. But I just so anyways, the Democratic Party strategy for dealing with this has not worked. It's been a failure, and it's unfortunate. I also just wanted, if you have this tweet ready, Matt, I wanted to highlight this also hilarious example of Democratic Party galaxy brain takes. So this is a writer, Mark Harris. There you go. Thanks. Mark Harris, who tweets, if Barrett is confirmed and Biden adds 2 justices, SCOTUS will consist of 6 GOP and 5 Democratic appointees. It tells you everything about the Republican Party, that they're the ones screaming, that's cheating. There is nothing funnier to me than this kind of strategy, that they're going to pack the court, but they're only going to pack the court with 2 more appointees so that the right wing still has a majority on the Supreme Court, right? That they're going to fundamentally alter this institution, but they're not even going to do it in a way that will help them win. I mean, that is 100% the example of what you get from liberalism.
Yeah, that's the managing democracy versus it comes to mind that rock the boat, pack the court, don't pack the court.
So we have pack the court, SCOTUS. I feel like I'm just in like a wacky kids show all day.
Oh God, yeah. But again, my official position on this is still we have to wage a political battle against the Supreme Court and completely delegitimize and push back on any idea that it has the right to overrule the Congress or the democratic will of people. We have to understand that this is an institution that has never had our back and is going to continue to play that role, and especially now it's continued to be reactionary. And we are going to get nowhere from the mainstream of the Democratic Party. They are going to continue to allow for this nonsense to fester, even in their wild fantasies. They're going to keep a Republican control of the Supreme Court. So we just have to be prepared for a very long fight ahead. But we also need to, start thinking constructively about how we're going to deal with these institutions instead of just shouting slogans, for example, like abolish the Supreme Court, right? That's something that, I agree with, but you need to look at, the history of this country and how we can win those kind of victories. I'm not saying don't be radical, right? But what I am saying is that slogans aren't a victory in and of themselves. We have to start preparing the groundwork for pushing back against these powerful institutions that we're fighting.
Yeah, I want to circle back to the originalism or textualism or constructionalism, all the different isms for it. Fundamentalism is really the key frame to put it in, and that's the context that Dan Nexon put it in. And he writes, originalism is a U.S. legal theology, and I think this is exactly right. Mm-hmm. Its adherents claim to slavishly follow the doctrinal principles laid out by a now deceased emergent consciousness, quote, the framers. These principles, it so happens, converge almost perfectly with contemporary right-wing policy. And that's exactly right. In a fundamentalist context, right, the fundamentalist leader says, I know how to interpret this Bible, I know exactly what God meant, and that's why you need to listen to what I say. And I say, take your clothes off, basically, right? That's all this is.
Yeah, exactly.
I mean, lots of times that is where that ends.
Exactly.
I mean, I know you're being facetious, but that most people who claim to know how to interpret the Bible, it does end with someone being forced to take their clothes off.
It also happens with GOP leadership, actually. So,
for sure.
Which is what I want to talk about in the post game.
Well, before we get there, patreon.com/TMBS, folks. We have a lot of fun stuff coming up. Some reading series we're kind of just going to set up forth on. Got some interesting stuff this winter that you'll be excited to hear about. You guys have anything you want to sweeten the pot with?
And Napoleon and I had a really great conversation, Napoleon to Legend, last Sunday. That was really nice. David's been posting some really awesome articles that people should check out weekly. that's the sweetener I have. Any more Splenda from either of you?
Well, I just wanted to add, I think that Matt and I have been talking about, we're still sort of kicking this around, but we're going to do some, more close readings of, for example, like maybe revisit the critique of the Gotha program, some classic Marx. But for people who are already patrons, we'd love to hear, maybe what your text you'd be interested in, especially if you want to go to like more Marx, if people would be interested in doing Engels. Listening to your conversation earlier, Alicia, made me think that, revisiting some classic Engels might be interesting for folks. So please reach out with anything that you're interested in. We always love collaborating with all of y'all, and definitely continue supporting the show at patreon.com/TMBS. We really appreciate all the support we've gotten over the past couple of months.
You sound like me.
Thank you, folks. And post gamers, we will see you at around 9 o'clock p.m. So in about a half hour. So
I've been like rushing to the post game. I don't know. This week I've just been like tunnel vision getting to the post game.
I'm ready to tee off on some. I'm going to talk about corporations are destroying humanity's ability to inform itself through consolidated media, and we got a pretty infuriating case study. So I look forward to that. Anyway.
I'm going to be talking about why Gwyneth Paltrow named her company the GOOP. No, I won't. All right.
All right, everyone. I'll see you on the other side.
See you.
Bye.